Hey guys, today we're going to be talking all about how to be a great podcast host. My name's Alice Violet. I've been working in podcast production for 5 years and content creation and marketing for 10 years. I'm also the host of the Cyber Made Human podcast, so do check it out. It's also available on this YouTube channel. So let's get started with 5 tips. So the first thing to consider is, what is the purpose of the podcast? If you're a technical specialist or you've been working in your industry for a long time, but you're not a marketer, now is the time to think like a marketer. So what we want to know is, what's the purpose of the episode? Who is your target audience? And what does your audience get out of listening to this episode? The second thing to consider is your background, perspective, and opinion is valuable. You don't want to just be anyone that could be reading out those questions. You've been chosen to host the show, or you've chosen yourself to host the show for a reason. I often work with businesses, and when I'm training their podcast hosts, when I'm meeting them in person, I'm shocked at how much personality they've got because they're very formal and stiff on the mic. So do feel confident to bring a little bit of personality to the show. Also, if you've got your own perspective or background, for example, if you've worked in a completely different field, or maybe you've published some research somewhere, or even you met your guests before an event, bring all of that to the mic. Give wider context for your audience. Number 3 is understanding the perspective of your guest. What's their background? Do a little bit of research on them. Or I always recommend having a pre-podcast chat, which is 10 to 15 minutes of informal conversation before every episode, even if you know your guest, because it gets everybody comfortable and builds confidence. So whilst you're having that pre-podcast chat, you could say, just so that we're practicing, sitting in situ with the mics, can you tell me a little bit about your background? And that can be a really great way of actually getting some information about them that you didn't know. Especially if you've known them for ages and they've been your friend for a while, you may not have realized they studied at a certain university, and it's a great way of bringing more context to the show. So number 4 is, if you do have multiple guests, try and encourage them to talk to each other, especially if this is audio only. You don't want it to just be you asking questions to one person and then in the next bit you asking questions to another. You want it to feel more like a conversation that's naturally flowing. So encourage them to answer each other. You can say, what did you think about that, even if it's not the topic that they're leading on. And then finally, my 5th tip for you is all about verbal cues to use on the mic. And this avoids you having to go, oh, sorry, can we cut there? You can say all of this verbally to move things on whilst you're speaking. So the first one is, often people will say, just in the interest of time, or I know that we're running out of time. I would really avoid saying that. Instead, you can say things like, well, we've covered a huge amount today. Just to wrap this up, what are your closing thoughts? And this has really demonstrated that we could do a whole nother episode on this topic, but for now, what do you think? Just to demonstrate to your guest that you are wrapping up the topic and you're running out of time without literally saying that on mic to your listeners. Another tip is to say at the beginning of the show, coming up on today's show, just like I did at the beginning, I told you we were going to be covering 5 tips on how to be a great podcast host. Hopefully you've stayed to hear all 5 of them. Similarly, if you're on a microphone and you're saying to your guests, we're going to be covering this topic, and then we're going to hear from this person, and then finally we're going to talk about this, it means that they know what to listen out for and what to expect from the episode. Another verbal thing to consider on the mic is saying hello to your guests and giving them space to actually say, hi, thanks so much for having me. And this is important if you've got multiple guests that have a similar voice, because if you're doing audio only, it might not be clear who they are. So then when you say something like, what's the latest in cybersecurity legislation about X, and you ask a person, it's not clear which speaker you're now referring to. Whereas if at the beginning they've got a nice sentence to get their voice, their accent, their pitch across, by the time they're then talking later in the episode, it's clear to the listener who that person is. Finally, it's good to have your guests have a call to action at the end where they can say, this is where you can find out more about me if you're interested, or this is where you can connect with me, so that listeners can stay in touch. And it's great for you to give that as well. Well, there are our 5 tips. I hope you found that useful. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've got any other tips, do feel free to share them as well. Thanks for watching, guys.